2020 and indeed 2021 was quite challenging for Africa's most industrialized economy, South Africa. The coronavirus almost wrecked everything since it met an economy already on life support due to high unemployment and a growing league of individuals who felt left behind and had stopped seeking employment. Despite all the upheavals, South Africa has remained resilient. Recently, President Cyril Ramaphosa assured South Africans of a better tomorrow and mapped out areas of intervention in the State of the Nation address. And now, the nation's Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana presented a budget that backs up the president's focus on businesses in a bid to create more employment opportunities. The minister, who is 6 months into the job, announced some tax relief to boost investment and consumer spending, which should help stimulate the economy. However, he had to balance that with measures to stabilize and eventually reduce government debt. Today, we will be reviewing South Africa's 2022 budget to see what hope lies in there for the country's economy and its citizens. This is Business Edge. I am Lekon Onobanjo, deputizing for Tolu Lokpe Adeleru Balogun. You're welcome. And joining me from Cape Town, South Africa, on Business Edge is Dr. Thanti Mthanti. He's a faculty at the University of Cape Town Graduate School of Business. You're welcome, Doctor.
Thank you for having me.
We'll start this way, Doctor. South Africa's 2022 budget touched on several issues that's been in the news for a while. We talk about loan burden, welfare, job creation, and the likes. Now, we'd like to know, what is your general assessment of the tone and direction of these budgets?
It's a budget that's caught a bit in between. The social pressures it tries to respond to them. And I think the government has a clear policy of debt consolidation. So there's a bit of austerity. And it's really caught between the two.
Go ahead, Doctor.
Well, it's caught between the two. So the social pressures because of the poor economy, obviously, and I think the finance minister has tried to respond to that by extending some of the social protection measures, like the social distress grant. It has been extended. At the same time, you are seeing an attempt to bring the country to a primary surplus sooner rather than later. That, of course, that balancing act is helped by the comparatively high commodity prices. And the windfall from the high commodity prices seem to be split between those two priorities, consolidating or reducing government debts and getting towards a primary surplus. And at the same time, in not a very structured way, but rather opportunistically, depending on the pressures as they avail themselves or as they reflect in society, the government seems to be trying to pepper through the cracks of social pressures, like we saw in the July unrest.
Oh, Doctor, there's a lot that the government is doing, and based on its forecasts, the country's economic growth will average 1.8% over the next 3 years. And even though it's said to drop to 4.8% from earlier 5.1% as earlier projected. But the question is this actually a fair assessment or expectation, or should we consider this an underestimation of South Africa's economic turbulence?
Well, I would think the growth figures, I think they're projecting next year, which is a more credible projection. So 22-23, they're projecting it at 1.8%. That is highly likely. The South African economy hasn't been growing by much for a long period of time. Last year, we saw the bounce back from COVID. So the economy is likely to have grown 5 or 6%. The growth projections are more or less okay, but what's concerning with them is they do not really start to deal with the unemployment problem. South Africa, as I'm sure a lot of your listeners know, has very high unemployment, on the extended definition, it might be 43% now. We lost 2 million additional jobs during the COVID crisis. 2 million jobs were lost. About 15% of the labor force lost jobs. We haven't begun to recover those. And with these growth projections, with this current budget, it's not really clear how we're going to move about addressing the unemployment issue.
Let's move away from the unemployment issue and talk about the welfare spending, which is being said to be a major point as considering the budget. Now, government will spend 44 billion rands on the jobless relief payment scheme. Is this huge cost sustainable, despite the fact that it is a populist advantage that is being talked about?
It's 44 billion rands on a social distress grant. That's about 350 rands a month. In dollars, it's about just above $20 a month. All right. So it's not necessarily a lot of money for the people who are unemployed or couldn't work or who are in the informal economy and they've sort of been forced out of it. Again, the allocation is only for 1 year for 44 billion. That allocation last year had been withdrawn, and with the July unrest, it was reinstated. Whether it's realistic budgeting to assume that in the next financial year, 2023-2024, that will fall down to zero, as the current budget indicates, I'm not really sure. There are lots of social pressures in South Africa. There are a lot of people with zero income. There needs to be a more structured way of, number one, getting them into work, and if they're out of work, of providing some sort of social relief.
Well, talking about a more structured way, we understand that South Africa government is into a lot of debt, so to speak. How do you think they will be able to generate the fund with which to pay for the job relief payment scheme, if this will actually come on board?
Well, South Africa, I think what people don't appreciate is South Africa is a net international creditor. So when you look at its external position, it's quite strong, right? It's quite strong because its net international investment position is positive. And for about 5 years now, it's also been running a trade surplus. In the last couple of years, it started running a current account surplus. So its external position is strong. Largely, the country doesn't borrow in dollars, borrows in rands, right? And it's got institutional arrangements that enable it to absorb pressures. So the country may have a lot more fiscal space than it assumes. It's not as heavily indebted. It doesn't face any balance of payment problems. It's got a very, very deep financial markets, large pension funds domestically and financial institutions, banks that can support government debts in the bond markets, right? So it's got a lot more fiscal space than it has. Its pressing problem, contrary to what the current government assumes, its pressing problem and the way to reduce debt sustainably is by fostering economic growth and getting people back to work. That should be the central thrust of public policy making. But when we saw with the president's speech emphasizing structural reforms, and this current speech by the finance minister that we're discussing emphasizing austerity, it's still an austerity budget. Over the next 3 years, non-interest expenditure in real terms is going to be cut. It's negative. So instead of emphasizing austerity, they need to shift and look at growth.
All right, thank you so much, Doctor. Let's take a look at spending on infrastructure, which is set to go up 812.5 billion rands. Now, is that too big or is that too small? And equally, which projects do you think would expectedly receive more attention and funding?
Well, my view is a lot of the talk around infrastructure spending, a lot of it is in terms of encouraging public sector participation, the government using a lot more blended finance, right? That will be largely for economic infrastructure. What is more pressing in South Africa, in my view, is social infrastructure, linking people in terms of transport to work, issues like housing, spending on building hospitals, spending on addressing really the apartheid deficits, because the apartheid government clearly did not wish to spend a lot on social services for the Black majority. I think that should be the greater focus, and it should be more on budget spending. So some of the projections around infrastructure spending are contingent on private sector participation. We've heard of a lot of plans around infrastructure over the last 4 or 5 years, and increasingly all we've seen is a decline in investment, right? A decline in investment by the private sector and by the states, with some of the state-owned companies pulling back. So we'll see how the plans translate to reality.
Well, definitely, Doctor, we get to see. I would like you to stay with us for a while. I will rejoin you in a bit, even as we continue to look at this issue surrounding the 2022 South African budget. But then, South Africa's economy has been struggling for some years now. And of course, the pandemic, talk about civil unrest, unemployment rate, and all whatnot, have further debilitated the country's drive to improve its financial base and business environment. Well, this year's budget is believed to herald a new dawn of beautiful things to come for the various sectors and welfare of the citizens. But then, how will the Ramaphosa administration balance the books with borrowings bearing down on its purse? We get to find out about this and other issues during the course of the program, so you just get to stay with us. Business Edge on New Central Television. We'll be right back. Thanks for staying with us on Business Edge, even as we continue to engage Dr. Thanti Mthanti, who is a University of Cape Town lecturer and Graduate School of Business. Now, back to you, Dr. Thanti. Let's talk about electricity for a while. Now, interestingly, the ESCOM issue didn't get much airtime from the minister. There is no announcement on the company's debt restructuring. Now, what is the solution to the lingering power issues in South Africa?
Well, once again, it's a question of resolving the ESCOM debt issue so that it can have the necessary funds for it to maintain its plans, for it to invest in new capacity. But I think a lot of the issue is for it to maintain its plans and to finalize its bill program. Once again, the finance minister didn't really speak to that, because currently, ESCOM, although it's improving a bit, it makes nowhere near enough money to, number one, service its debt payments, so interest and principal, which come in at about 60 billion. And number two, to maintain its investment, which usually comes in at about 25, 30 billion. So ESCOM needs annually about 100 billion rands, right? Those are its financing needs. And currently it's making an EBITDA or cash flow of about 40 billion. So there's a big gap there. Some of the developmental finance institutions are still lending ESCOM money. Government has been putting in money, but that is projected to decline. And it's not clear where ESCOM will get the money to fund its operations from.
The finance minister, Dr. Tani, talked about narrowing down budget deficits, but then the budget deficit projects that total borrowing this fiscal year is about 412 billion rands. Now, is this an underestimation of the amount that South Africa would need to borrow from the financial market to meet its targets?
Well, I think partially I've been trying to indicate that it probably is, partially because certain things, the social pressures, additional social support for businesses or what have you, have not been factored in. That's number one. Number two, cash calls from parastatals, especially from ESCOM, have not been factored in. Number three, we've got a bit of increase in inflation. Public sector wages, the increase in public sector wages has not been factored into this budget, right? The assumption is that the budget will hold, but there will be no additional expenditure either coming through from any one of those three elements. So that speaks to the credibility of the budgeting process itself. And we've seen this. We had the same issue last year, right? There was no consideration of extending the social relief grants. There was no consideration of extending any additional funds to parastatals, and we saw them being extended, in particular to SISRA, right? There was no consideration of a public wage settlement, and that increased by 20 billion as well from baseline. So the budgeting itself, sometimes to somewhat extent, is not realistic, right? But the government has to portray a face of trying to maintain fiscal austerity whilst it's facing a lot of fiscal and social pressures. And it's got to balance between those two.
Well, obviously, we cannot exhaust all the contents of the budget, but then one area that actually begs for scrutiny is the anti-corruption crusade of the president. That's President Cyril Ramaphosa. Now, looking at the unexplained wealth aspect, where taxpayers with assets of more than 50 million rands are expected to declare, what does this actually say about the president's fight against corruption?
I think it's more a fight against his own political opponents. I don't think there's been any serious fights against corruption. It seems to be selective. It seems to be targeted at certain individuals. And number two, it seems to be an outright cover for incompetence or a lack of capacity within his own government, right? So, I mean, we haven't seen any results besides targeting of his political opponents, any concrete results from fighting corruption. If you look at all the parastatals, they are worse, from Eskom, Transnet, Denel, the arms manufacturer, all of them, PRASA, they're worse. They're in worse states than when he took over in 2018, almost 4 years ago. So where are the fruits of this fight against corruption? The fight against corruption seems to be a cover for him and his government to really avoid their own incompetence. That's number one. And number two, to target his predecessor and his political opponents.
Well, that's some serious thoughts coming from you, Dr. Mthanti. Now, one other area that we cannot not talk about and of course affects the youth is the issue of unemployment rate. Now, Godongwana says the government has allocated 76 billion rands for job creation to improve the country's job creation drive. Now, do you actually see this as a meaningful way of reducing unemployment rate in the country?
Not really. A lot of unemployment in South Africa is structural. The unemployment problem is massive. Virtually 50% of the population that is working age is unemployed. Almost half the working age population does not work, right? So allocating 1% of GDP to some projects here and there, it's going to paper over the cracks. If the government genuinely wants to address the unemployment issue, it really has to review its economic policies and its developmental strategy and start to align that with the population it has. South Africa has largely followed a developmental strategy that focuses on services. What we've seen growing the most are services, tertiary services, financial services, medicine, sectors like that needs highly qualified people, right? And in turn, we've seen the wage premium for skilled workers shoot through the roof, but the country doesn't have those workers. It's not a European country. It's not a country that can base its economy around speculation in financial markets or around medicine or what have you. It's got largely a young population that is largely uneducated, right? And it needs to design an economic strategy that can absorb that population into productive activity.
Well, are you saying that this budget does not actually provide for that in terms of policy creation and direction? Are you saying that this budget, 2022 South African budget, is not adequately capturing all the areas that are needed to improve the sectors of the economy?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't even attempt to. It's an austerity budget at its core, but it tries to deflate and address the short-term immediate pressure. Yeah. But at its core, it's an austerity budget. It cuts, it doesn't seek to stimulate, right? It's got no clear direction of how you use fiscal policy to address some of the core issues that are a problem in this country. There's no review of economic policies. There's nothing. It's steady as she goes. I'm happy with 50% unemployment. The finance minister talks as if it's none of his business. The Reserve Bank governor talks as if it's none of his business. The president doesn't even highlight the sense of crisis. I mean, if you've got half your population unemployed, you have a massive crisis in your hands. It doesn't even highlight how important that is, how getting people into work matters. You have fathers with families who have not had jobs for decades. You have kids who are coming out of school who face the prospect of unemployment for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Young people who cannot start their lives because of this unemployment issue. And with the government, with the policymakers, with the president, the finance minister, it's steady as she goes. It's as if it doesn't matter. They don't matter, right? The economic policies they're following are optimal. Well, what they are doing, they are giving us unemployment. That is the primary result of the fiscal policies, the macroeconomic policies they've given us. What we've gotten in huge measure, we haven't gotten any growth from them. We haven't gotten any macroeconomic stability from them. What we've gotten by the caseload is masses, millions of unemployed people.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Thanti Mthanti, for joining us on Business Edge. Really an expose coming from you. Really appreciate your presence.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Well, South Africa Minister Enoch Godongwana has described the economy as one that will portend great things for the country, despite the fact that it's experiencing more than a decade of economic stagnation. But then he says the government will accelerate investment drives in all areas with the hope that these will ensure a sustainable economic growth where South Africa can create enough jobs to reduce poverty and inequality and enable it reach its goals of a better life for all its citizens. Well, our guest today has actually diverged from that, but then in the coming years or weeks or months, we get to see how that will eventually pan out for South Africans. Well, thank you so much for joining us on Business Edge. Before we run off on the show, let's quickly go on a break and return with NC4 to watch. Do stay with us. On NC4 to watch, let's tell you that Brent oil surged about $100 a barrel for the first time since 2014 as Russia's attack on cities across Ukraine sparked fears of a disruption to the region's critical energy exports. Futures in London jumped as much as 5.4% after Vladimir Putin ordered an operation aimed at demilitarizing the country. The April contract for Brent was at $101.51 a barrel at 12:39 p.m. Singapore time, after briefly touching its intraday high of $102.08. West Texas Intermediate was at $96.11 a barrel. Moving on now, gold has hit its highest level in more than a year after Russia ordered troops into Ukraine. Spot gold jumped as much as 2.1% to $1,949.03 an ounce, the highest level since January 2021, and traded at $1,939.55 at 1:08 p.m. in Singapore. The Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index rose 0.3%. Silver, palladium, and platinum all advanced. Elsewhere, Kenya Power's workers are threatening to go on a strike in a dispute over the firm's plans to lay off 20% of its employees, or nearly 2,000 staff, most of them aging. The job cuts are part of Kenya Power's efforts to run a lean operation and compensate for revenue losses that followed the January cut in electricity prices by up to 15%. And finally, Zimbabwe has selected Kuvimba Mining House Limited, a state-owned company which has been shrouded in controversy, to revive one of the continent's largest steel mills. The miner, which already has vast interests in gold and nickel, has been picked as the investment partner to breathe new life into the Zimbabwe Iron and Steel Company, which has been shut for 14 years. At its peak, the plant produced nearly 1 million tons of steel a year. And that is the size of our package on Business Edge for today. Do not forget that you can visit our social media platforms, that is at News Central TV. You can also download our mobile app on App Store and Play Store and join the conversation on our website, www.newscentral.africa. Many thanks for watching. Until next time, I am Liko Onobanjo.